So, let's talk about one of the biggest questions out there. Why did Jesus actually have to rise from the dead? You might be surprised to hear that the answer doesn't just start with an empty tomb. Nope. It really begins thousands of years earlier, with a wild story about a burning bush that, believe it or not, is the key that unlocks the whole thing.
Okay, so let's really get into it. Why was the resurrection so necessary? Well, the answer starts with the world we all know. A world that's full of suffering and injustice and, the shadow of death. We've all felt that. And we've all probably asked the question at some point, does God even see what's going on down here? Does he care?
So, where do we find the answer? Well, the sermon we're exploring today argues that the key isn't found first in an empty tomb, but way, way back, with a shepherd named Moses standing in front of a burning bush. This single moment in the book of Exodus basically sets the stage for God's entire rescue plan. So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the problem that needs solving, a world of suffering. Then, we'll dig into what this voice from the fire reveals about God, that he's holy, that he remembers his promises, and that he actually comes down to do something about it. And finally, we'll see how this ancient pattern gives us the ultimate guarantee of the resurrection.
All right, first up, a world of suffering. This is the backdrop for everything that follows. It's the whole reason a rescue mission is needed in the first place. So at this point in the story, God's people are in a really bad spot. They're slaves in Egypt, completely crushed by Pharaoh. And here's the kicker. Hundreds and hundreds of years have gone by since God made these incredible promises to their ancestors. I mean, can you imagine? From their perspective, with all the silence and suffering, it must have felt like God had totally forgotten them.
And right in the middle of that silence, that's when it happens. A voice speaks from a fire. And this is where we learn the first really crucial thing about the God who is about to step in. He reveals his holiness. And you can see the parallel so clearly here. On the left, in Exodus, God shows up in this mysterious, unquenchable fire. Then, fast forward centuries later in the Gospels, and God reveals himself in a much more personal way, in the flesh, in the person of Jesus. The pattern of God making himself known to us, it starts right here. So when God tells Moses he's on holy ground, what does that really mean? It's not just, clean ground. It means set apart, totally pure, completely other. The sermon really drives this point home. God is near, but he is not like us. He isn't safe or predictable, and Moses gets it instantly. He hides his face because he's terrified. That's the right response to holiness, not some casual, hey, what's up, but deep, reverent awe. And this is where it gets really mind-bending. You'd think a perfectly holy God coming near flawed, messy people would just mean destruction for us. But the resurrection completely flips that idea on its head. It's the ultimate proof that God's holiness comes not to wipe his people out, but to save them.
Okay, so God is holy. Check. But the story keeps building, and what we learn next is just as important. The second thing God reveals from the bush is that he is the God who remembers. In other words, he sticks to his promises, his covenant.
I mean, just think about the timescale here for a second. God makes this massive promise to Abraham. Then, hundreds of years go by. It looks like total silence. A whole nation is born and then forced into slavery, and only then does God speak from the bush. And get this, the very first thing he does is remind Moses of that ancient promise. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
And that is what we mean by covenant faithfulness. What feels like a huge delay, or even abandonment to us, is not forgetfulness to God. His promises don't have an expiration date. He's pretty much telling Moses, the plan is still on. Nothing has changed.
And here's where the connection becomes undeniable. Centuries later, Jesus himself quotes this exact line from Exodus, and his logic is just brilliant. He points out that God says, I am the God of Abraham, present tense, not I was. This proves that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still alive to God. Death didn't break the promise. And if death can't break God's covenant, then resurrection isn't just a possibility, it's basically a guarantee.
Okay, this leads us to the third and, honestly, the most personal revelation about who God is. This isn't some distant, hands-off God. No, this is the God who sees, who knows, and who acts. This is the God who comes down. The words God speaks to Moses here are just so powerful. He doesn't just say, yeah, things are tough down there. He gets specific. He breaks it down. I have seen their suffering. I have heard their cry. I know what they are going through. And the sermon points out that in the original Hebrew, it's even more intense, as if God is saying, seeing, I have truly seen.
Absolutely nothing has slipped past him.
But then it gets even more profound, because in the person of Jesus, God doesn't just observe our suffering from a distance, he literally dives right into it. He experiences rejection, betrayal, physical pain, even death itself. So think about that. The God who sees your pain is the same God who has felt pain. And this right here, this is the phrase that changes everything. After all the seeing and hearing and knowing, God declares his action, "I have come down to deliver them." This is the heart of the whole story. Rescue doesn't start with us trying to climb our way up to God. It starts with God coming down to us, always.
And that brings us to our final piece of the puzzle, where all these threads, God's holiness, his faithfulness, his compassion, all come together. This pattern of God coming down to deliver finds its ultimate fulfillment and its unbreakable guarantee in the resurrection.
Here it is. This is the punchline of the entire narrative. The God who came down to enter our world, our suffering, and even our death, well, he didn't stay down. He came down to deliver, and he rose from the grave to make sure that deliverance sticks forever.
You can see the pattern so clearly when you put them side by side like this. The rescue from Egypt was a preview, a trailer for the main event. It was freedom from Pharaoh's bondage, leading to a promised land. But Christ's resurrection, that's the ultimate reality. It's freedom from sin and death itself, leading to a whole new creation.
There's a quote from the theologian Timothy Keller that the sermon uses, and it just nails it. The resurrection is God's declaration that the worst thing is never the last thing. It's this powerful, definitive statement that suffering, injustice, and even death, they don't get the final word. So what does this guarantee for us right here, right now? Well, according to the sermon, it boils down to three huge certainties. First, our salvation is a done deal. Second, our suffering is not invisible to the God who entered into it himself. And third, because he conquered death, our future is secure. So in the end, when you step back and look at the big picture, you see it. The pattern that started with a voice from a burning bush is now complete. The holy, faithful, and compassionate God who came down to rescue his people has now risen from the dead to secure that rescue for all time.
And that really leaves us with a huge question, doesn't it? The resurrection isn't just some old story to remember on a holiday. It's a living reality that's supposed to change how we live right now. So the question for all of us is this: if the absolute worst thing is not the last thing, and if death itself has been defeated, what does it actually mean to truly live today?